Everyone knows the story of Jesus being born in Bethlehem, which we just recently celebrated with the Christmas holiday. Sometime after the birth of Jesus, King Herod was informed by wise men from the east that a king of the Jews would be born in Bethlehem. After finding the child, the wise men were warned of God in a dream that they should not return to Herod. When Herod discovered that he had been deceived by the wise men, he had all of the male children killed who were ages 2 years and under in Bethlehem. Some sources put the estimate in the thousands, but modern scholars typically put the amount in a very conservative range of fewer than 50 babies, and maybe only 10 to 20 babies because of the small size of Bethlehem. But regardless of the number of children that were killed, it was a horrific, barbaric act, and one for which King Herod is infamous. But what else do we really know about him? Much of what we know comes from Josephus, who wrote about Herod's life. And Herod is actually a fascinating historical figure. To learn more, join me for today's episode of All Things Apostolic. The Edomites were the descendants of Esau. They originally lived in an area called Edom, which was southeast of the Dead Sea, with their capital being Bozrah. Sometime after Jerusalem's destruction in 586 BC, however, the land they occupied was destroyed in fulfillment of prophecy. Seeking refuge, the Edomites migrated west and settled in the former Judean territory, roughly in and around the city of Hebron. The area they controlled was eventually referred to as Idumea. Idumea was the Greek version of the name Edom, while the people were referred to as Idumeans. From 141 BC to 37 BC, the Hasmoneans were the ruling Jewish dynasty of Judea. A man named Antipater I of Idumea had some type of official high-status position in the court of the Hasmonean king. Around 72 BC, Antipater had a son named Herod, who would later become known as Herod the Great. Herod's mother was a princess of the Nabatean people from the city of Petra, which is modern-day Jordan. Some of the Idumeans had converted to Judaism, but it's not clear if this was a personal choice or if they were forced. Neither of Herod's parents were technically Jewish, but a previous Hasmonean leader and high priest, John Hyrcanus, had conquered Idumea and forced its citizens to convert to Judaism. So whether it was a personal choice or forced, Herod was raised as a Jew. In 63 BC, the Roman general Pompey conquered Jerusalem and made it a client state. Rome allowed local Jewish rulers to run the day-to-day affairs of state in Judea, but Rome remained the controlling military and political authority. In 47 BC, Herod's father, Antipater, due to his support of the Roman Empire, was made the first procurator of Judea, Samaria, and Galilee by Julius Caesar. Antipater made his son Herod the governor of Galilee around the same time. In 43 BC, Antipater died of poisoning, and after this there followed a turbulent period of infighting involving Herod's brother and various Roman factions. In 40 BC, the Parthians attacked both Syria and Palestine, taking Jerusalem in the process. Herod's brother was taken captive, and he committed suicide shortly after. Herod was forced to flee to Rome, and Antigonus of the Hasmonean dynasty was installed as ruler at Jerusalem. Herod appealed for Roman help in reinstating Hyrcanus II as king, However, while he was in Rome, Herod, who was known to have served Rome well in Judea, was appointed king of the Jews by the Roman Senate. This all but assured that he would have the Roman backing needed to oust Antigonus and take the throne himself. Thus began a war for the throne of Judea, which lasted several years. During this campaign, Herod, who had already been married and had a child, married Hyrcanus II's granddaughter, Mariamne. This was clearly a political marriage, done purely to legitimize his claim to the throne. He thus had his first wife and son banished. Josephus writes that in 37 BC, Herod and the governor of Syria at the time gathered a large army, apparently at the urging of the Roman general and politician Mark Antony, and they entered Jerusalem. They conquered the city and captured Antigonus, whom they then sent to Mark Antony to be put to death. This marked a major turning point in Herod's life and Jewish history. It was the end of the Hasmonean dynasty and the beginning of the Herodian dynasty. King Herod the Great would rule Judea as Rome's client king for more than 3 decades. Afterwards, members of his family, including his son Herod Antipas and his grandson Herod Agrippa, would go on to rule in Israel as well. Through his appointment as king of the Jews by the Romans and his conquest of the usurper Antigonus of the Hasmonean dynasty, Herod became the sole client king of the province of Judea for Rome. However, like all kings, Herod faced some difficult challenges. One major challenge came from his mother-in-law, Alexandra. Her daughter, Mariamne, had been given to Herod in marriage with the understanding that Herod would help reinstate the Hasmonean dynasty. However, soon after Herod's conquest of Jerusalem, it became apparent to his mother-in-law Alexandra that Herod had no intention of doing that. Mark Antony, soon to be engaged in a civil war over the rule of the Roman Empire after the assassination of Julius Caesar, had recently married Cleopatra of Egypt in order to join forces with her and become the next Roman ruler. Alexandra approached Cleopatra, asking her for help in installing her son, Mariamne's brother Aristobulus III, who was only 17 at the time, as the high priest in Jerusalem. While high priest was obviously a religious position, it also was a position of power, which often led to the throne. You can see how Herod would have felt threatened. Fearing that Mark Antony would place Aristobulus on the throne of Judea, Herod began sending spies to follow Alexandra and Aristobulus. Soon after, while Aristobulus was bathing in the palace at Jericho, Herod had him drowned. He would later have his wife Mariamne and Alexandra killed as well. Meanwhile, the Roman civil war between Mark Antony and Octavian had begun, and Herod had to choose a side. Having had a previous connection with Mark Antony, he chose to support him, only to see Mark Antony lose the final battle at Actium in 31 BC. Herod had backed the wrong horse. Octavian now became Caesar Augustus, the first true Roman emperor. Herod desperately sought to forge a connection to him in order to maintain his throne. He was eventually able to convince Augustus that if he were to be allowed to remain as king of Judea, he would remain loyal to Rome. With Augustus's acceptance of this agreement, Herod became a mostly autonomous ruler of Judea. As long as nothing happened to challenge Rome's wealth or power, Herod could rule as he pleased. Herod's reign was largely a peaceful one. By 30 BC, he had regained control of all the territories that the Hasmoneans and Cleopatra had taken. Then between 23 and 20 BC, he expanded his realm into northern Galilee and repopulated certain areas with sympathetic settlers. Herod was considered a gifted administrator by some. He created a new priestly class by abolishing the hereditary qualification for office, and he created a more multicultural elite. He embarked on a series of grand building projects. In fact, this is how he attained the title Herod the Great. His greatness stemmed from the monumental construction projects that he accomplished. The most famous project was a lavish refurbishment of the Temple of Jerusalem. In about 19 BC, Herod initiated a massive expansion of the temple complex in Jerusalem, eventually doubling it in size. Herod also expanded the city's fortification walls and added a theater and amphitheater. He built several impressive fortresses, including Masada. While these were monumental sites, some of which, like Masada, can still be seen today, he actually built them mostly for himself and his family in case of mass insurrection against him. Perhaps the most ambitious of Herod's projects was the Herodium Fortress, 11 kilometers south of Jerusalem. Outside of Judea, the Greeks and Romans found his charm and his extravagant benefactions irresistible. He was very Hellenized. He loved theater and sport, so he constructed hippodromes, organized festivals, and supported the Greek Olympic Games. He journeyed multiple times to Greece, sponsoring building projects in prestigious cities such as Athens and Rhodes. And he erected public buildings, palaces, and even entire cities. He supported religious architecture and showed interest in non-Jewish cults such as Apollo. Even the names he chose for some of his children, Philip, Olympias, Alexander, and Roxanne, recall the royal family at Macedonia. So did the Greek names of most of his wives. Herod admitted feeling much closer to the Greeks than to the Jews. Despite his achievements and the prosperity of his kingdom, it came at a considerable cost to the majority of the Jewish society, which had to bear heavy taxation and even religious indignities. Among other things, Herod erected a great golden eagle, which was the bird of Zeus and a Hellenistic and Roman symbol, over the temple gate. When the people later, when they thought that he was dying, a group of young men tore down the eagle and cut it to pieces. At home, King Herod was despised for his ruthless oppression and cruelty. He aggressively suppressed dissent by forbidding protest and often killing any who opposed him. Herod was known to be highly paranoid, at one time using 2,000 soldiers as his personal bodyguards. This paranoia and cruelty fit well with the familiar story in the New Testament that is often called the Massacre of the Innocents. Herod's extermination of his many opponents and supposed opponents, notably the Hasmoneans and their supporters, is clearly recorded. In addition to executing Mariamne, he also executed 3 of his own sons. This gave rise to the celebrated phrase attributed to Augustus, in which he supposedly said that, quote, "It's better to be Herod's pig than his son." Remember that being raised Jewish, Herod would not have eaten pork. So, according to Augustus, it was safer to be a pig than to be Herod's son. King Herod had had some battle wounds and health issues in his life, but he became seriously ill when he was about 70 years old. He moved to his palace in Jericho. Josephus describes an ulceration of the intestines with particularly terrible pains in the colon. Additionally, there was a malignancy in the abdominal area, as well as putrefaction in the private member, which was creating worms. So whatever the medical condition was, and there's debate about that, it is clear that Herod suffered tremendous pain, so much so that he even attempted suicide. Plus, there is evidence that his mental state was deteriorating as well. Some surprising new evidence regarding Herod's mental state has actually been recently discovered in the lava desert of northeastern Jordan, a 2,000-year-old kind of graffiti written in an early Arabic script by a local nomad, referring to, quote, the year Herod died mad. Now, this may reflect only the personal opinion of the individual who wrote it, but it is the only surviving testimony from that period, aside from Josephus. And it matches with what we do know, that Herod was horribly troubled in both body and mind when he finally met his end. Herod knew that he was hated by his Jewish subjects, despite his efforts to appease them. As he lay dying in Jericho, he called a group of Jewish leaders to his bedside. When they came, he had them imprisoned in the hippodrome. Fearing that he would not be truly lamented on his death or mourned appropriately for a king of his stature, he gave orders that when he died, his death should be kept a secret until the men locked in the hippodrome had first been murdered. His death would then be announced, assuring that the mourning at his funeral would be genuine, because the people would actually be mourning for the Jewish leaders, but it would give the appearance as if they were mourning for him. Fortunately, his orders were disobeyed, and the men who were shut up in the hippodrome were released on Herod's death. Herod was buried in a tomb on the slopes of the Herodium. In 2007, this tomb was excavated, but the sarcophagus within it was damaged and empty. Probably it had been opened during the first Jewish revolt in the century after Herod's death. Herod's kingdom was divided by the Romans between Herod's three sons, Herod Antipas, Archelaus, and Philip. Herod the Great has a mixed legacy. Although he did accomplish some spectacular building programs and he elevated the stature of Judea in the ancient world, he will mostly be remembered and known as a murderer of innocent people, whether they be his own family, others he considered a threat to his ambitions, or innocent Jewish babies. Thank you for joining me for today's episode of All Things Apostolic. And until next time, take care and God bless.